G'day everyone, and a big welcome to Unit 4 for the Legal Studies Guide. A couple of things to note first off is that we have had a bit of a change of design. Same overall design, but have rolled in with a different picture at the start because as we all know, Unit 4 is centred around lawmaking and Parliament in particular. So we've changed our backdrop to a nice picture of the Australian Parliament there, and we've changed our blue colour to match the beautiful pink of our logo the whole way through. Obviously, kickstarting at area or key knowledge point 4.1.1, which we'll talk about in a moment. Unit 4 will have to feel our way through a little bit. Obviously, as we know, new study design this year. The interesting thing about Unit 4 is we don't have those principles of justice that we have for Unit 3 to kind of tie everything together and to finish off each set of slides. So we'll be looking at different skills as we go through, and there's some evaluation skills that cover multiple knowledge dot points that we'll have to tie together where we can, but there's other dot points that kind of just sit and work independently of anything else. So a lot of stuff that does work together, and at times there'll be references to future slides or things like that, and a lot of stuff as well that just kind of exists independently of any of the other points. So it'll be nice and challenging. Our quote to start is from Karen Lamb, and I think a great one to start Unit 4. A year from now, you may wish you had started today. Hey, it doesn't matter how Unit 3 went for you. It's a new chapter, Unit 4. It's a new 25% of your mark to kick off, and make this the day that you start. So set your goals, have a look at what you did in Unit 3 and try and challenge yourself to improve again in Unit 4 and build up towards that exam at the end of the year. So 4.1.1. We are today looking at the roles of the Crown and the Houses of Parliament, both Victorian and Commonwealth, in lawmaking. This is quite a dense dot point for not really, I suppose, any skills at the moment. So we do have to compare at some point the constitutional lawmaking powers of the state and Commonwealth parliaments. That builds on the roles, a little bit of both of them, but that's very much to do with the next dot point. And as we'll see when we go through, there is a direct skill related to the roles in lawmaking, but it actually comes in area of study 2. So that's where we're looking at limitations of the Parliament in making laws, and the structure and roles of each house comes into that. So we're actually going to need to learn this and know this now in case there's any specific questions on it. But in terms of actually using it and building off it and analysing it a little bit, that won't come until area of study 2. At the end of today, you should be able to tell me or tell your teacher or tell your classmates what roles the Crown and the different Houses of Parliament play in lawmaking. So let's jump into it. A couple of key vocab points. This was actually a question a fair few years back on the Legal Studies exam, was to differentiate between Parliament and government, and it's language that we're going to use in every set of slides from now on. We're going to talk about Parliament at different times, we're going to talk about government, and it's very important that you know the difference. So just in general, like the general definition, Parliament is an elected group of representatives who make laws for a society on behalf of those people who voted them in. So it's parliaments all over the world with different names. You know, there's the Congress in the United States, there's British Parliament, so on and so forth. In Australia, we have parliaments because obviously we were founded by Britain, and we have to be really clear that we have a Commonwealth Parliament. So that is our federal parliament that oversees all of Australia. And when we talk about the Commonwealth Parliament, we are talking about all elected members of the House of Representatives, Senate, and the Governor-General, no matter what political party they're from. Then we have the Victorian Parliament, again, all elected members of the Legislative Assembly and Legislative Council from all political parties and the Governor. And then if we're just ever talking about government, and we just mentioned government, we're talking about all elected members of the political party or coalition of parties that wins the most seats in the lower house. So Parliament is basically everyone who's elected, whereas government is just those elected from the political party that has the most seats. So it's government that basically runs the country, decides on policy and what direction they're going to take us. But it is Parliament, in both senses, Commonwealth and Victorian, that make our laws. So obviously the government has a big say in that, and because they have the majority of people in Parliament, they ultimately choose what laws we are going to make. But laws in general are made by all of Parliament. So we're just going to have to be really clear with that distinction as we work through. In order to know the roles of the different houses of Parliament, we first need to understand their structure. So Parliament is structured in what we call a bicameral way, and we can look at this slide first. So bicameral being a Parliament that operates with two houses, an upper and a lower. So in the Commonwealth Parliament, we have what are called two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Reps being the lower and the Senate being the upper. And then we also have a Governor-General who represents the Queen. So as we can see from this little diagram here from the Parliamentary Education Office, you have the Governor-General, the Senate and the House of Reps, and you get the Parliament of Australia. So what do we mean by houses? The House of Representatives, as we said, commonly referred to as the lower house, means the chamber. We call it the House of Representatives. It's a chamber in Parliament, the green chamber that you might have seen pictures of, where there are 150 people elected to sit in that chamber, and these are each elected from equally populated sections of Australia known as electorates. So they basically take Australia's entire population, 25 million, and split it up into 150 equally sized chunks depending on population. So there's some electorates that cover, a quarter of Queensland because there's no one who lives out there in the middle of Queensland, whereas one electorate in Melbourne might just cover two suburbs once you get to that figure. So about currently, I think, getting up to around 170,000 people in each electorate. Which then obviously has fewer voters once you remove children and people ineligible. Elections are held every 3 years approximately to elect these new 150, and this is the House of Government. So the Prime Minister always sits in the House of Representatives. It's where you might see Malcolm Turnbull on the news sometimes in the Green Chamber answering questions and talking about what the government's up to. Then you've got the Senate, which is the Red House or the Upper House. And this is a little bit different. So rather than 150 from equally sized areas, the Senate has 12 representatives from each state, regardless of their population, and 2 from each territory. So 76 all up. So pretty much just over half of what the House of Reps has. So Tassie has 12 senators, and New South Wales has 12 senators, even though New South Wales has approximately 13, 14 times the population of Tasmania. Each senator is actually elected for 6 years, not 3 like the House of Reps, and you elect half of them every 3 years. So every time there's an election for the House of Reps, we are electing another 38 senators. So some of those will be returned, who were in previously for another 6 years, and some will be new. As we saw in that first slide with the definitions, the Commonwealth Parliament is all elected members of the House of Reps, the Senate, and the Governor-General. So when we talk about the Governor-General, we are talking about the representative of the Crown, or the Queen at the moment, the King if she dies and hands over to King Charles, or Prince Charles for now. The Governor-General is just one individual. They are appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister picks them, even though they're formally appointed by the Queen, and they fill a largely ceremonial role. So our current Governor-General, Peter Cosgrove, a lot of his work is in ceremonial duties. He goes around, he opens things, he talks to school groups, community groups, goes to sporting events and stuff like that, and he's kind of a figurehead of Australian democracy. But they do have, the Governor-General does have some specific roles we will look at. So pretty simple, 2 houses, 150 here, 76 here, and then 1 Governor-General, and that makes up the 227 members of the Commonwealth Parliament. The structure of the Victorian Parliament is pretty much exactly the same. Quickly look here. You've got a legislative assembly, a legislative council, and a governor. So just slightly different names. The lower house being the legislative assembly, which has 88 members as opposed to 150. Again, from equally populated areas to make sure that everyone's vote equals the same. Slight difference is that the Victorian Parliament has their elections every 4 years. Every 4 years on the last Saturday in November. So it's a set date. That will happen every 4 years. So there's actually an election this year. So if you are 18 before that last weekend in November, you will get to vote this year. It is the House of Government, so the Premier sits in the Victorian Parliament. So Daniel Andrews, our current Premier, and it's also coloured green, just like the Federal Parliament. Then you've got the Legislative Council, the Upper House. This time, similar, I suppose, to the Senate, you've got them from different regions. So we elect 5 representatives from 8 regions. So those regions are 3 rural regions: Western Victoria, Northern Victoria, and Eastern Victoria, so around the outsides, and then the metro areas, which are split into 5. So I think north, east, southeast, south, and west. So these guys are a little bit different, obviously not representing any states' interests or anything like that. Come from the major political parties again, and these guys are elected just for 4 years, so they're just on the same 4-year cycle as the Legislative Assembly. So we elect all 40 of them every 4 years. Just like the Commonwealth Parliament, we have a governor as well at the top, and the governor is the representative of the Crown. Again, they are appointed on the advice of the Premier this time rather than the Prime Minister. Okay, the Premier gets to choose them, and again, largely a ceremonial role. So Linda Dessau is the Victorian Governor at the moment, and again, she'll open things, she'll do talks to school groups, community groups, fundraise, that sort of stuff. So largely ceremonial. So the dot point is specifically looking for us to know the roles, and again, understand how that limits Parliament in area of study 2. But in terms of knowing the roles, you can, or you could expect to get asked potentially a specific question like, can you explain the one role of the House of Representatives? That's the sort of question you would have got asked out of the old study design, or explain 2 roles of the Senate. So we do have to be aware that we may get asked questions specifically on this knowledge and need to be able to recall it when asked. So what I've done here is I've listed all of the different roles of the House of Reps, but we are going to go into 3 in detail. But 5 roles here. The House of Reps determines government, it initiates and makes laws, it provides responsible government, it represents the people because you come from equally populated areas, and it controls government expenditure. So it keeps an eye on what that political party with the most seats, keeps an eye on what they're doing with the government or with the country's money, particularly because the Senate can't initiate supply bills, and we'll look at that quickly in a moment. 3 roles for the Senate: initiate and make laws, House of Review, and act as a States House, which we'll talk about what that means, and the Governor-General, Royal Assent, Executive Council, and reserves powers. So as I said, we'll break down the House of Reps and we'll just go into more detail on 3 of these, and probably the 3 easiest. So the absolute, I would say, number 1 role of the House of Reps, and the easiest one to remember, is literally it's there to make laws. Like, this is what the whole purpose of our Parliament is to make law. So to make a new law, I'm sure you might have hopefully learned about this in junior school in humanities, fingers crossed, if you've got a good civics curriculum at your school. But to make a new law, the House of Reps has to agree on it, the Senate has to agree on it, and then the Governor-General has to sign it off. So the House of Reps is integral to lawmaking. They obviously have to agree to make that law, but most often, or most bills, because it is the House of Government and where the Prime Minister sits, most bills actually commence here. So most bills are initiated in the House of Representatives, introduced by the government, and then eventually voted on, and they're always voted through because the government always has a majority of the seats. As I said, because it is the House of Government, any supply bill must commence there. So supply bills are those that are to do with money. So any money bills around, the budget and that sort of thing. Second role to remember, and the easiest one to explain, is that the House of Representatives will determine the government. So literally the political party with the most seats, or the coalition of parties, so in our federal parliament, the National Party and the Liberal Party always join their seats together. But the political party or the coalition of parties with the most seats in that house becomes the government and runs the country, and their leader becomes the Prime Minister. So currently that is Malcolm Turnbull and the Liberals and the Nationals. And if at the next election Labor wins more seats than them, Labor will become the government and their leader the Prime Minister. So as is sometimes the misconception in the public eye and in the media, we don't directly vote for our Prime Minister. You only get a chance to vote for Malcolm Turnbull if you live in the seat of Wentworth, I think, in Sydney, where he's your elected representative. You are just voting for someone from your local area, and if their party gets the most seats, their leader becomes the Prime Minister. So it's a little bit about who's going to represent you the best in your area, and hopefully the rest works out. Finally, the role of the House of Reps is to provide responsible government, because it is that House of Government, because it is where the Prime Minister is, and generally like a larger proportion of the ministers, so people who have portfolios like the Treasurer in charge of finance, the Foreign Minister, the Minister for Immigration, perhaps the Attorney General, who looks at, who's kind of like the Minister for Laws and lawmaking. Most of them will sit in here. Some might sit in the Senate, but generally most of them will sit in the House of Representatives. Parliament has regular question time. You can watch it live streamed from Parliament's website and sometimes on the ABC. And this is where those guys have to answer any questions that the opposition has or other members of Parliament have, and they have to answer them truthfully and honestly about what they've been doing whilst they've been running the country. This ensures responsible government because these ministers are then held accountable. So if they've done the wrong thing, the question will be asked. We'll hear about it as a public, and we'll be able to take action to make sure that maybe they don't get elected again, or there's enough public outcry that they get sacked from their position. So the House of Representatives provides a forum where ministers must be accountable, and this therefore provides responsible government. So that's one of the roles of the House of Reps. The Senate, let's look at literally the same thing here. Number one role, initiate and make laws. It can't be a law unless the House of Reps, the Senate and the Governor-General agree. So the role of the Senate is to make laws. They have the same lawmaking power of the House of Reps, except that they cannot initiate supply bills. It's the only difference. And some bills can be started in the Senate. So particularly if, say, you're the Minister for Veterans Affairs, which we have a Minister for in Federal Parliament. I'm not sure who that is at the moment. But if you're the Minister for Veterans Affairs and you sit in the Senate and you've come up with a new law that you want to pass through in relation to Veterans Affairs, you would be allowed to introduce that in your House, which is the Senate, and it would start in the Senate and then pass down to the House of Representatives before going to the Governor-General. So there's no set order it has to go in, it just has to be passed and voted on by both. Because most bills start in the House of Representatives though, the Senate does really act as what we call as a House of Review. This means that they will often get the bills second after the House of Reps has already looked at them. And because the government has the most seats in the House of Representatives, it's pretty much always just passed through. Like they'll, do their due diligence and it'll take a couple of months, but it will just get passed. Whereas what happens is in the Senate, the government rarely has a majority as well. So there's only been 2 times in Australia's history where a political party has had more than half the seats in both houses. So only 2 times in history they've had more than half the seats in both houses, which meant they could just pass everything. That's what we call a rubber stamp Senate, so a Senate that will just agree and pass everything the House of Reps does. Usually though the Senate is hostile, and this means that the government doesn't have a majority, which means every bill has to be heavily scrutinised, and the government has to convince other people to vote with them, as opposed to just getting their own people to vote. So that makes sure, so the Senate reviews things and makes sure that anything that's passed is actually in Australia's best interests. So really important role of scrutinising legislation there. Finally, you've got this third one that a lot of kids like to use, because it's easy to explain, is that the Senate historically is a state's house. Each state is equally represented, so Tasmania, 500,000 people, whatever the population is, 12 senators. New South Wales, 7 million plus people, 12 senators. Why this is because when we decided to federate and become one country, the smaller states like Tassie, particularly with the House of Reps, they're only going to get a few people in the House of Reps, and New South Wales is going to get a heap. Same with Victoria. States like Tassie and Western Australia were really worried that the bigger states would just pass laws that suited them. Obviously, we weren't as, technology wasn't as good, you couldn't really communicate easily. So it was expected that people would just vote on their local interests. And as a result, these smaller states were really worried that the Australian Parliament would only make decisions to suit New South Wales and Victoria, because that's where most of the people were from. So what they said had to happen was the upper house had to have each state equally represented, so that the senators from Tasmania, Western Australia, etc. could stop things getting easily passed that would maybe not benefit their state as much. So as a result, we ended up with 12 from each state, so they're all equally represented. And historically, that's what the Senate is there for, to make sure that each state has an equal voice in the Parliament. What happens now is, because of political parties, that people from Tasmania who are in the Liberal Party have to vote the same way as people from New South Wales who are in the Liberal Party, no matter what, or they risk getting kicked out of their party, is that the Senate doesn't really act as a state's house anymore. People vote based on their political party, not based on the state they're from, or it's very rare for them to vote against their political party. But it is a historical role that the Senate plays, so it's one to definitely note. Finally, you've got the Governor-General, and absolutely number one, to be honest, I'll talk about these quickly, but you don't necessarily really need to know them. There's nothing specific about specific roles you need to know. So just really know royal assent. And that is the idea that, as I've said, for both the Senate and the House of Reps, for something to become law, it has to be passed by the Senate, the House of Reps, and the Governor-General. And that's what's known as royal assent. It's literally the Governor-General signing the bill, saying, there's a little bit of text that says, on this date, I assent to this. And this formally makes it an act of Parliament. So it goes from being a bill, something that's being considered, to becoming an act of Parliament. And it's the formal signing off of a bill that the Queen approves of. It is a formality. It doesn't get refused. There is one example of the Victorian governor refusing to give royal assent in 2005 on the advice of the Premier. But outside of that, it literally doesn't happen. They always get given royal assent. A couple of other really quick ones. The Governor-General is technically the head of state of our country, so heads the executive, which is the branch of government, or the government which runs the country. But this is really just a formality that they meet occasionally as an executive council with the Prime Minister and the ministers. But the Executive Council and the Governor-General act purely on the advice of ministers and the Prime Minister, so it doesn't actually play an active role there. The other one that is interesting is what are called reserve powers. So these are some powers that aren't in the Constitution. They're there by convention or by tradition. These are things that the Governor-General doesn't technically need the advice of the Minister or the Prime Minister to do, doesn't need approval from the Parliament to do. And these are things like they actually have the ability to fire a Prime Minister and dismiss a government, which Sir John Kerr did in 1975 with Gough Whitlam. He said that the Parliament has lost faith and I am obliged to step in and fire. So Whitlam got fired and Malcolm Fraser became the Prime Minister. And they can end parliamentary session. So Parliament meets for 3 weeks, or has sessions that run for generally 3 sitting weeks. And the Governor-General does have reserve powers to be able to end these. Again, doesn't use them, but could. And again, doesn't dismiss a government. It's only happened once in 1975 and was very, very controversial. So very unlikely that it would happen again. Look, we need to know the roles of the Victorian Parliament and the Commonwealth Parliament, and the Victorian Parliament. You will note here that these are, for the Legislative Assembly, exactly the same. As a lower house, it fills the same roles. And it's the same for the Legislative Council, except we remove the States House for the Legislative Council because it can't act as a States House because it is obviously only within one state. And then you've got the Governor in Victoria that serves the same 3 roles. As I spoke about, the skill for this one really comes up in area of study 2. So it's not one to really be concerned about for now. We could be asked direct questions on our knowledge of their roles, but in terms of skills, this one is discuss the factors that affect the ability of Parliament and courts to make law. So when we get into area of study 2, this is where you might talk about the government not having a majority in the Senate, so having to convince other political parties to vote with them. That would obviously affect their ability to make laws, so on and so forth. So that's the sort of stuff we look at in our next area of study. So a question like this is off the VCAR sample exam. Explain 2 factors that may affect the ability of the Victorian Parliament to implement the recommendations of the VLRC. So to change the law, and you might be able to say, well, you know, the government might have a majority in the Legislative Assembly but not in the Legislative Council, and therefore they are unable to pass these laws because the other political party doesn't agree, or something like that. What we're going to do at the end of each slideshow in Unit 4 is just put in a set of links like we did last time, but rather than have them really linked to that skill, just some links to go to. And this is one that I'll put in basically every slideshow nearly for this area of study is www.peo.gov.au. So PEO stands for Parliamentary Education Office. This is an absolutely phenomenal website that has outrageously good fact sheets about different aspects of Parliament, and we'll have information on basically everything we do in this area of study. So go and have a look there to get yourself some more information about some of this stuff, because this has been quite a long video and I really only skimmed the surface, and you can go so much deeper into the roles of each of the houses and their history and stuff like that, and that's a great website to do it at. Ultimately, as we finish our start of Unit 4, I'm off to an absolute flyer and have put up the wrong conclusion slides. But our essential question we should be finishing on, as I flick back through to the start, is what roles do the Crown and the different houses of Parliament play in lawmaking? Hopefully you can look at the fact they initiate and make laws. The Senate has a role of being a house of review. The lower house has a role of determining the government as well, and the Crown obviously offering or providing royal assent. Again, welcome to Unit 4. It's great to have you back on board, and hopefully we can smash through and get some great results again. This has been the Legal Studies Guy. Make sure to subscribe and leave some feedback.